So, colleagues, good morning, everyone. Thanks again for joining us here today in the morning. I know it's very early. It's the second week. We're all a little bit tired. So, once again, thanks for joining us here today. We've got an array of speakers here today. Unfortunately, two of our speakers, the Minister of Barbados, as well as the Ambassador, are still somewhere either on the bus or in the car. We're getting them in very, very shortly. In the meantime, I think we have a great set of people here that we could talk about the particularities in operations here for the vulnerable countries. And funnily enough, we've got representation here from Vanuatu, but also from the Pacific community, as well as from the Commonwealth Secretariat. So people that have been working in the field in the small island development states in particular, but also in other areas, at least for the Commonwealth, that is the case. Commonwealth Secretariat, apologies. Colleagues, once more, my name is Andreas. I'm the head of the Independent Evaluation Unit here at the Green Climate Fund. This session here is supposed to be very interactive. We want to hear from you. We want to get into a conversation about what works, what doesn't. That is usually what evaluators are looking for. So I'm very, very excited and looking forward to this. Before we start, let me also just give you a brief overview of what the IEU has been doing. So we came to this wonderful title that we have here for the session today. So the IEU was, the Independent Evaluation Unit was mandated to undertake evaluations of the group of the vulnerable countries of the GCF. And that is described by the SIDS, the Small Island Developing States, by the LDCs, the least developed countries, as well as by Africa. So those are the three groups that we've been asked to evaluate the GCF investments, the effectiveness and efficiency and relevance of the GCF investments in those areas. And we've done so in 2020, in 2021, and this year in 2022, we are finalizing the Africa evaluation. We've actually got the task lead just right sitting there. This is Daisuke Horikoshi from my team here. He completes this task of the Africa evaluation in about 2 months. So we've done this to improve the set of tools, modalities, and operations that the GCF currently has. And there's obviously a wide range of tools that the GCF could deploy. To only name a few, readiness is, for instance, one of them. So the GCF has the Readiness and Preparatory Support Program that supports countries in the preparation for climate finance and access. The GCF also has a small window that's called Simplified Approval Process. It's called SAP, which is there for smaller projects to scale projects that have been in the piloting stage before. And then the GCF also has requests for proposals. So the GCF is not only waiting for projects from the countries, it's also putting out several requests for proposals where it's saying, okay, we would like to have projects in certain areas, such as mobilizing funding for scale, such as enhanced direct access, and RED Plus results-based payment projects, to only name a few. And those are these type of modalities that the countries have at their disposal. And what we are finding is quite startling to some people, but at the same time, it's also quite well known that the GCF has still some things to work on. So let me just now introduce the panel that I've got here. And then I would dive right into a very brief presentation. And I've been told by my team I should not speak longer than 5 minutes, so I won't speak longer than 5 minutes, perhaps 6, but not longer than that, for sure not. And then after that, we hear from our colleagues in the field on reflections of what is the experience in the vulnerable countries. And again, I'd love to hear as well from you. So before I introduce the panel, can I just get a show of hands of who we have got in the room here? So who is from the civil society? Do we have anyone from the civil society? There, a little bit, half civil society. That's interesting. We've got civil society here. Sort of, again. Research, okay, we will go, but let's do it this way. Let's say, who's from research? Oh gosh, so there's academics in the room, guys. Can I just ask here in the back, where are you from?
I'm a PhD candidate at Northwestern University in Chicago in the States.
Thank you very much. That's really great to hear. Can I ask you?
I'm an assistant professor at Sciences Po in Paris.
Wow, thank you. Great to have you. And climate-related topics, I believe. Okay, and just
Yeah, hello. I'm also PhD candidate at Lund University, Sweden.
thanks. That's great. That's great to hear. So, can I just get a show of hands of who's here from a national designated authority, from an NDA of the GCF? Do we have anyone? We don't. That's okay. Do we have representation here from an accredited entity? We do have Dirk there. We do have a colleague here. Just to introduce yourself briefly.
Hi, my name is Austin. I'm from Zambia National Commercial Bank in Southern Africa, Zambia.
Great to have Zambia here, and great to have the commercial bank there from Zambia. We've heard accreditation is really an important topic for you, so it's great to see that. Then, do we have any negotiators in the room for any country representation, parties? No, we don't. We don't. Maybe somebody's thinking about it. I don't know. No. Oh, here we go. Okay, over to you. Just a brief introduction of who you are.
My name is Tarama Jack. I come from Burkina Faso, and I am among the team of my country delegation.
Thank you, enchanté. Thank you. Very nice to meet you here. Okay, great. So now I realize we have not heard from the observers over there. I see that on your tag. Just can I get a brief introduction from you as well?
I'm Charlotte. I'm also a PhD candidate at the University of Leuven in Belgium, working on climate policy in Africa.
I'm a master's student in economics from Duke University and the University of Potsdam in Germany, and I'm also interested in environmental economics and evaluation.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we get actually some young folks here that are really interested in climate finance. That's really great. Okay, colleagues, let me introduce the colleagues that I have here in front of me. So we've got, to my left, we got Dr. Christopher Bartlett. He's a climate diplomacy manager for the government of Vanuatu. It's a very interesting title. We just will hear more about this title. So Christopher, really nice to have you here. Christopher has been living and working in the Pacific Islands for over 2 decades. He's currently managing the governments of Vanuatu's climate diplomacy program. His extensive work with communities, civil society, private sector, and governments in the Pacific have shaped his current climate action interests around adaptation, biodiversity, development finance, and loss and damage. After being awarded a PhD from the James Cook University, he joined the Eleanor Ostrom's lab at Indiana University as a postdoc following global multidimensional resource management problems. He's also written a lot and published a lot of documents in regards to implementation of multiple national climate change projects, and has been in negotiations for loss and damage. So thanks for having you here. The next person to his left is Unikrishna Divakaran. It's a mouthful. I'm sorry. It's always difficult. He is the head of climate change of the Commonwealth Secretariat. So Uni is the head. He's looking after climate change programs of the Secretariat. Before the Commonwealth Secretariat, he was leading the Global Green Growth Institute India, responsible for facilitation of strategic delivery and execution of GGGI initiatives in the countries. And before that, he was serving as a UN FCCC officer in Bonn, responsible for climate finance and national adaptation plans, processes for the least developed countries. So great to have you, Uni. He's also had a long stint with the GIZ India, the GIZ India, as a senior advisor managing climate finance and natural resource management vertical under the Indo-German bilateral cooperation. So thanks for coming here, Uni, and it's great to have you. And to his left, we've got Dirk. And Dirk is a climate finance coordinator with the SPC, so the Pacific Community, a direct access entity with the GCF, and also a regional implementation entity with the Adaptation Fund. And SPC is a principal scientific and technological organization in the Pacific region, proud supporting the development since 1947, so very long time. and they have international development. They are an international development organization owned and governed by the 27 countries and territory members across the Pacific. In his current position, Dirk provides technical support and guidance to the Pacific SIDS in accessing climate finance to support their climate change priorities. He's also holding a master's in conservation ecology, specialized in community-based natural resource management. So that's again a great set of skills for the discussion that we have here today. So colleagues, we've done a round of introductions of the people here in the room. We've done a round of introductions of the people here up front. Allow me to make a couple of few remarks with regards to the presentation, with regards to what we found in the small island developing states. One of the 3 evaluations that we've undertaken there at the independent evaluation unit of the Green Climate Fund. So thanks. Cheers. Thank you. So colleagues, this evaluation was quite interesting because we asked a question in the Secretariat to see what is the approach for the SIDS, what is the approach for the small island development stage, and what we found is there's very little of a programmatic approach. So we needed, as evaluators, we needed to find something, and we went for the literature. We went for an extensive literature review to see what is the normative framework that we could use to build around the evidence that we found in lots of interviews, lots of country case studies, and a couple of surveys. And what we found is these 5 things here. And that's I'm only allowed to speak about those 5 things. So I wanted to show you that in picture. So what we found is there in the literature, as well as in our evaluation, we found there is a question with regards to flexibility. And that's hugely important for the small island developing states, as they need flexibility from organizations such as the GCF, not only in the financing and in the understanding of context, but also with regards to the policies that they've got. The second question is with regards to capacity. Now, one could say, okay, capacity, that's always an easy thing. People need the technical capacity on the ground, but here we found a nuance. When you look at the small island developing states, you're obviously acting at a regional level, such as Dirk, and you're acting also at a national level, represented here by Chris. Sorry to misuse you a little bit here, but just to show you this picture. And what we found is that regional entities are just overwhelmed with the range of requests from the different countries, and they do not have enough bums on the seat to be able to execute everything that's coming in for the region. For the national entities that we've got at the GCF, we found that the capacity concerns here are very different, because they're most likely being on the question of how to link whatever we want at a national level with the technical expertise from accredited entities to then build projects on the ground. So a very different aspect of capacity. The third thing that we found was the urgency. The small island development states have done very little and contributed very little to the issues that we have with regards to emission levels, carbon emission levels, but they do feel it quite strongly. And they do require urgent measures put in place and urgent projects to build the resilience and increase low emission. Okay. Let me stop here just to say hello. Thanks. So colleagues, yes, and Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us. I'll introduce you in a very short while, just in a few minutes, when I've done the lovely introduction of the findings that we have here at the GCF. So the urgency I just spoke about. The next issue was with regards to high transaction costs. So if you look at projects, in particular in small island development states, but also in the least developed countries, we're facing concerns in the countries with regards to the high transaction costs. That is the coordination costs that we have across donors and across climate funds, but it is also the question of how much money one would need for really truly implementing a project. Lastly, adaptation. We found that in the SIDS there more than half of the projects are adaptation projects, but then again, we have very little engagement with the private sector. We have very little engagement that would help to scale the opportunities that are found with regards to adaptation. So, apologies. So, in terms of conclusions, I've put these in 5 conclusions to say the GCF modalities and processes are currently not sufficiently effective to address the urgency. So this is this question that I've just been talking about. When we looked at the different modalities, for instance, enhanced direct access, we found very little evidence that these were actually addressing the urgency problems of the small island development states. When we looked at the simplified approval process, we found that the simplified approval process was not simplified. In fact, it was actually more complicated and more long-lasting. So again, a concern of processing that needed to be addressed. When we looked at accreditation, and I spoke about regional accreditation and regional accredited entities as well as national accredited entities, again, we found that accreditation was disadvantaging the SIDS with low capacity and low experience and no confidence in accessing finance from the GCF. With regards to capacity, I spoke of this question of bums on the seat on the regional level, and at the national level, just the capacity to understand the technical concepts. Again, we found that the request from the GCF to come in with concept notes was considered a barrier. Because it was very difficult to come already at a very high technical level at this early stage when the project is not yet even formalized. So that is costly, and that is very difficult to deal with. And in that sense, the RPSP, so the Readiness Preparatory Support Program, as well as the Project Preparation Facility, both were ineffective in addressing these concerns with the colleagues. I wanted to show you as well, so we've done this question of access and capacity, and here you see that there's very little that at the moment that we have very little national entities in the SIDS. Most of the work is done, again, through regional accredited entities, and the problems are very clear there. The positive, we could spin this as well in a positive way. We could say the regional direct access entities are nearly 4 times more active in the SIDS compared to all the other countries in the GCF. So there are also some great learnings that are coming out of that. The other set of conclusions, and again, it's only these 6 pictures that I showed you, is with regards to adaptation. Again, we found more projects in adaptation in the SIDS, but most of them were grant-based. We did not know, it was very premature to talk about results, because even to date, the GCF committed funds, only 25% of the committed funds have been dispersed. So it's still, the fund is really still at a very early stage to talk about results. But there were other concepts that were not well explained. So for instance, innovation was very difficult to get, and paradigm shift, very difficult concepts to grasp. And then again, the private sector was not sufficiently articulated. We also done since then a private sector evaluation in 2021, which came to the same conclusion that a private sector strategy is needed for the fund. Lastly, I spoke about this flexibility, and this is the flexibility that we require in policy. So the fund has done incredible work in regards to accreditation and finding a new strategy. It's now working on a private sector strategy, but there's still other policies that have not been discussed sufficiently, such as concessionality, programmatic approaches, and lastly, restructuring, because we see rapid changes in the small island development states. So the context is changing rapidly. Projects need to be able to adapt and couldn't in the past. So the recommendations are basically aligned with these conclusions then. So we recommended that we would improve our PSP, we would improve readiness for access and capacity, really truly a complement alongside the accredited entities to build that capacity that we need, both in terms of bumps on the seat as well as technical. We also said that a PSAA approach should be considered and should be piloted. We should be thinking about a better simplified approval process. Lastly, a programmatic approach is absolutely necessary for the SIDS when you think about cross-sectorial work and cross-regional work. And for that, a programmatic approach is necessary. Private sector, again, we were saying that we need further engagement with the local private sector, better understanding the local private sector, as well as bringing in new private sectors outside, because the private sector in the countries may not be able to stem all the work. With that, I'll conclude here. This is just to give you a little bit of a teaser of what we've been finding in where the fund needs to move. So now I'll, apologies panel, now I'll use a couple of seconds to just introduce our new member here on the stage. So we're very fortunate to have the ambassador here. So Ambassador Satyendra Prasad. He's the ambassador and permanent representative of the Fiji to the United Nations. He's previously worked as a CEO in the Papua New Guinea governance facility. He's a senior advisor in the World Bank. He was also in the UK Department for International Development, and has been an academic for most of his time at universities around the South Pacific, in Fiji, the University College of Cork in Ireland, and the Ristomaikan Asian Pacific University in Japan. So we're very pleased. He's also here in his role as chair for the Pacific Small States, and advises the Pacific governments on climate and ocean issues, both within the UN processes and in other multilateral settings, such as the World Bank and the high-level panel on oceans. So we're very pleased to have him with us as well. For the next set here, I would like to invite the ambassador actually to speak to us first. And the guiding question here for our conversation today is, ambassador, what are some of the challenges and experiences of Fiji with regards to climate finance? Could you enlighten us a little bit on what these are and where these are setting? I might hand over we had issues with the mics. Let's go.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me, and thank you for sharing the analytics, which is very useful and quite insightful to many of us. So please share this analytics widely to the team, and congratulations for completing this work. And I hope it gives some guidance to GCF as well as to individual countries on what and where they should be looking at improving the GCF. Look, I'm not one of those, Fiji is not one of those countries which is constantly criticizing GCF. There are two fundamental starting points. GCF is the foundational fund for climate action in our type of countries, and we just have to make it work. And there have been some teething problems. Everyone is in the right direction, and we need to improve the pace and quality and of the changes that need to be undertaken. And I'm sure this will guide some of the changes underway. Second, you are in my sort of starting point again for GCF is to anyone who comes from a rich country, pay up your contribution to GCF. That's the starting point, right? And if you're taking too long to pay up, speed it up because of how important it is. And if you have the appetite for it, double your contributions to GCF. That's the fundamental starting point. The second starting point for countries like us is you can put everything in the stovepipe of GCF transforming and making transformative impacts. It's for countries on the front lines. The only thing that matters is whether people are becoming more secure, whether the work has been completed. It is none of the project design and the accreditation and all of these matters because small island states live from catastrophe to catastrophe, and they can't be too much worried and bothered about how long this transformation change. The only thing that counts and the only thing that must count is is how GCF is impacting on lives of people, communities, and countries in the areas it is supposed to make an impact. And no point talking to everyone who's part of the choir about urgency, because that point has been really made. So we know and we hope that this report will be received very positively, and that the GCF board and decision making will give utmost urgency to ensuring that the processes have been speeded up. For Fiji's part, uh, we have also been learning, and we have two institutions that we are accredited. One is our development bank, which has now increased done the reforms necessary to undertake 50 million size programs, and the Ministry for Economy, the climate ministry itself, and where we do infrastructure projects and things like that, is undergoing, and we hope it will complete its accreditation to be able to undertake 250 million size of programs. Both these two are very important things. The time for many small climate actions is long gone for small island states. They need to take transformative, programmatic approaches, and so bundling projects and putting them together into things that can work is the right way to go. We cannot be designing 500 seawalls in each year. You have to design one program about seawalls for the whole country, and that's 500 individual seawalls programmatized into a single project, because only some of the funding in the end can come from GCF realistically. Not all of the funding, and we should not be saying this publicly to you. We hope all the funding will come from GCF, but we're not there yet, right? So when we programmatized, take a programmatic approach, we put in one adaptation or mitigation area, a programmatic approach. Some amount of the grant financing will come from GCF, and that can be the flow for mobilizing and catalyzing other finance. And this is the space in which GCF should go. So if there's a 100 million grant from GCF, let's say for towards a $500 million project for completing seawalls around most vulnerable communities, another 400 million, we can then begin to go and look at other development partners, World Bank, ADB, and everyone else who comes into play. That is the space in which we need to be. So my final 3 points for GCF would be, this is absolutely the right way for us small island states. We should also be moving with pace in this way towards programmatic approach, being capable of undertaking medium-term transformations in our climate actions. Most of the climate actions can no longer be done in 3-year project cycles. Those people who think that these are 3-year project cycles, you are living in some mythical world. All of the climate actions require 5 to 10 to 15-year type of time frame in any sector you look at, and so that's where we need to be going. So that's and my second suggestion to the team is, but know that small island states have different level of capacities, and work hard and fast to ensure that small states are able to build up their capabilities internally, as well as share expertise amongst themselves. So there's no reason why Fiji should not be able to offer its capabilities now to Tuvalu and Kiribati if they requested it. That's one. I think in the medium term, there's no reason why we cannot use our contracting processes for smaller programs in smaller island states than ours. So there's lot to be done on that. And the last question would be, all of this, I don't think GCF could do in this traditional centralized way. It will need to decentralize itself. And we would welcome GCF to have a decentralized unit in the Pacific, close to where Pacific Islands are, and have devolved authority, and be able to make decisions closer to the ground and be able to interact with our governments on a day-to-day basis. So we welcome a decentralized approach, and I wish you very well. Congratulations on this report, very insightful, and please share our best wishes with the team. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. I know you have to leave very soon. I'll let you go. Any last words that you can give? What would Fiji want from the next GCF? That's, you know, we're starting the new strategy. We're thinking about what ways forward. Is there anything that that you wanted to add to this, or anything else? What would you want? That's okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Pleased to see you. Okay. Colleagues, so these were some really nice warm wishes. We've heard from programmatic approaches and transformational change. Our key incremental change is the time for incremental change is over. We truly need to shift the paradigm there. We've heard that it is about collaboration, regional collaboration, and a stronger knowledge sharing, and then sharing of even procurement, so sharing of something more practically related. And that's very nice to hear. And lastly, it's also the question of how is the GCF addressing itself, how it's positioning itself in the region. Very interesting comments here. I wonder if I can move over to Uni, if you wanted to reflect a little bit from the Commonwealth Secretariat perspective here. And again, the guiding question for you was what has been the experience with the accredited entities that you work with, especially those in Africa, tilting it maybe as well a little bit Pacific and Africa for the vulnerable countries in accessing the GCF. Thanks.
Thank you, Andreas, and thank you, GCF, for this opportunity to discuss this very important question. And I think we've been discussing this from the last so many days, and I don't think the whole 1 hour will be sufficient to discuss all that we have learned over the period of time, because just to give a background, the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub is a mandate provided by the member countries to the through the Commonwealth heads of the government meeting to support member countries in access to finance. So our model is to embed national climate finance advisors in the countries and to support the countries in moving the needle in multiple fronts in terms of enabling. So specifically on the question, I have I think multiple areas to discuss, but I'll restrict to 5 important aspects that we have learned over the years, over the last 6 years. So I think the need for continued support for direct access, I think that's we see this discussion moving into a conflict in terms of difference of opinion between the regional and the international accredited entities and the government priorities. I think aligning that is a bit difficult because of the various outcomes, expected outcomes that they set for the organizations as well as the countries, and the country outcomes are pretty dynamic because we don't know the climate extremes that hit, and then accordingly we'll have to readjust the policies and move the projects accordingly. But what happens is that in that process there is a conflict in setting the target. So obviously there's a greater need now to have more direct access entities in the country. We have also seen the positive effect of accreditation, especially of the development financial institutions and also the government and quasi-government institutions, is that the standards within those institutions, especially in terms of the ESG or the ESS criteria, the gender considerations into the project, because there are many refinancers who get accredited to the GCF. But in that process, at least they've started now thinking when they refinance, because that's the large-scale financing that is happening in the natural resource management space, which is nothing else but adaptation. They try to integrate these elements and aspects of vulnerability into the financing part. So I think that's important. And also like the community institutions and their role in delivering these finances. We've been like discussing with the UNCDF under their local initiative in terms of how the decentralized model of financing can become more effective, because that's where I think many projects are for example approved, but we have seen that when the implementation happens, the community-based institutions are either not ready, or sometimes power centers take away the project into different directions in terms of implementation. So obviously there need to be more focused capacity building integrated into the project itself, so that that process become more. And also structuring of disbursement schedules and management of the project. I think that's again an important aspect that need to be discussed, and that has a strong alignment to the accreditation process actually. So the implementing entities basically the kind of capacity decides the disbursement schedule, and also the executing entities capacity in that way, because unless that's well aligned, the disbursement will delay, leading to project implementation delays and of course underspends. I think that's something which we have noticed in many countries, but we generally don't get into that space of implementation yet because our capacities are limited. We support largely project development. I think that's where yesterday our Secretary General was telling to the Honorable Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC that we probably need more advisors per country, more than one. But right now the financial constraints allow us only to place one advisor in the country, because the requirements are now different. And coming to my second point on development of the robust pipeline of projects, that's again something which is very, we have a lot of learnings there, especially in terms of the need for developing robust theory of change for a particular project, because we have seen some of our projects getting responses from the GCF, such strong responses from the GCF that that we cannot take these projects any further, like especially on the mitigation projects in SIDS. So we have recent experiences when SIDS submit projects to on mitigation, especially on forestry and others. There's a very strong pushback that we have seen from the funding lines, but without much explanation in terms of why some of these projects are not coming out. So I think we need more support from these multilateral funding sources to give us clear direction in terms of why certain set of projects are not taking, because I can give specific examples, but maybe we can have another discussion directly with the GCF and the country to discuss some of these projects. Here I think we talked a lot about interdepartmental coordination, the programmatic approach. I think one of the major requirements of programmatic approach is multi-sectoral engagement and multi-department engagement, because I can give examples of water-based projects that we work in the African region, where the groundwater sits in one vertical, the urban water supply sits in one vertical, and we also have huge transition happening in many of the countries from rural to urban. And we have the peri-urban spaces where you don't have a governance structure in place, because in the urban space, if you look at the urban spaces, there are governance structures in place, but in the rural place, there are community-based institutions. But if you look at the transition zones, it has started from there, not yet reached there, and the institutional architecture is somehow missing there. And that's an increasing space. And if you look at many of these member countries, we see a transition of around 30 to 70 people migrating from rural to urban space per minute. So that's the space where we are working, and we are now gradually seeing that issue coming up in the kind of peri-urban space and urban projects that we encounter. And the human and institutional capacity building support is my third point. And I think we have talked a lot about this, but I believe that in countries, the most important part of human capacity building is the process of learning by doing. And I think GCF is doing quite a good work in the regions by going down to the countries, working with them to see how some of these projects successfully worked, how it failed. Actually, I think the failures are more important than successes in that space. And I fondly remember a colleague from Antigua and Barbuda speaking about the fact that as the GCF should work as a startup, so that we all should engage in the startup and co-create this institution. So GCF is one case. I think that applies to Adaptation Fund, SIF, and all others actually. And again, the point on moving to the programmatic approach, I think we have got a couple of very good examples from African region. So we recently, the country that we are supporting in the African region, which is Eswatini, which is a classical example where in this COP, Eswatini was awarded, along with many other African countries like Zambia, Botswana and all, the African Nationally Determined Contribution Award. They picked up, there was a jury formed in the region. Investors were invited to review the projects, and these projects were awarded based on a very strict review. And Eswatini won the Best Initiative under NDC Award for the urban development. So this is basically a kind of a project which definitely gets the investors confident, and that will hopefully enhance the confidence of the funders, and programmatic approaches thus emerges from 50 million to 800 million. I think to scale up, that could be a good approach in terms of a nationally determined criteria to position some of the projects as best practice and fit for purpose case, and then the funders see and investors see this as an opportunity. I think that's quite a replicable model, because we have chambers of commerce, private sector entity groups, and also we have intelligence and experience in the country to have projects, to evaluate such projects actually. And coming to the last bit about again, private sector engagement is something which we are still far behind, but probably this could be a good approach where we take it to the private sector, evaluate it, and fit it to the criteria and take it forward. My last point is again knowledge management for replication. So as Commonwealth, with our 56 member countries, we do have a seamless exchange of ideas and information. But it's also important that we need to share these country experiences wherever there are successes, especially we have started seeing such examples. So I think more vigorous knowledge management, more vigorous joint events, and we are very happy to engage with the funding lines to see how we could provide these, because I'm talking from my practical work that we are doing in the 17 countries. We do have a lot of learning that need to be captured, but of course many a times what happens is that in the process of engagement we don't get the time, or neither we get the kind of financial resources to do. So maybe we should partner there and capture these learnings and deepen these positive engagements, and reduce the gaps therein actually. So I think I have a lot to talk, but looking at the time, I would like to stop, and we're happy to answer any question. Thank you, Andreas.
Thank you, Uni. Again, great to hear from the Commonwealth Secretariat. And I must add, it's an interesting conversation to have, because it has so much similarities with what Ambassador from Fiji has said about the collaboration that's needed, the learning that's needed, doing these things together when they're difficult. And that ties in very well to your question of, okay, let's look at capacity, but let's look as well as at knowledge management and how we do that. And then the importance there is to think about scaling through replication, to think about scaling through that learning that we need. Colleagues, I want to turn very briefly to see if in the audience you have any questions before we move on with the last two speakers to share their views again from the regional aspect in the Pacific, but also from Vanuatu. Anyone wants to come in? Give a couple of seconds. I see nobody. Okay, that's all right. Then we'll go right over to Chris. Chris, if you wanted to share a little bit the experience from Vanuatu and from the perspective of Vanuatu, it would be interesting to hear that. Also in light of all the other speakers that we've had before. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, and good morning, colleagues. I'm very pleased to bring you some real experiences from a country who is experiencing devastating gaps in the amount of finance that has been mobilized to support us to address our own ambitions. Just to give you a picture, over the last 10 years, Vanuatu has mobilized around about $100 million from various climate finance sources. One storm costs us, on average, $500 million to address the impacts. So you can see in 10 years, we've managed to mobilize just a fraction of the needs. Vanuatu has been forced to allocate our own national budgets to address the impacts of climate change. This year, 2022, our government was forced to allocate 15% of our national recurrent budget to addressing climate impacts. That is the same scale of investment that we're making in education, and it's the same scale of investment that we're making in health. So you can see that climate finance is wholly inadequate. The GCF is the tool that we have all agreed as a primary source of finance for developing nations and for SIDS, and we urgently request that mobilization of finance through the GCF is upscaled. Let me tell you a bit right now about the IEU process. So we thank very much that the GCF does have an independent evaluation unit, because it allows us to have very frank conversations with the GCF that you wouldn't necessarily have with a donor, because we can be concrete and tangible about where things are not working and where things are working. The readiness program that we developed and discussed with the evaluation unit has been an incredible start to the process of Vanuatu being able to articulate our climate finance needs. And that readiness program, I'm very proud to say, has led to Vanuatu's revised and enhanced NDC this year, meeting the Glasgow Pact. By doing a readiness, which helped us put together a GCF funding program for the country, we were able to say, we're not going to do an NDC just on mitigation, but we're going to do an NDC that reflects the entire commitment to Paris that we all made, which includes mitigation, it includes adaptation, and it includes loss and damage. And each one of the pillars not only has a whole range of projects that we started through readiness, but it's costed. So we can go to donors and say, do you want to support the NDC? Here's our loss and damage needs in great detail and cost. So I think the process has helped us not only mobilize finance in the GCF system, but also to address the Paris Agreement commitments that Vanuatu, one of the most vulnerable nations on earth, has been able to make to the global level. Now, there are a couple of points that I wanted to make, some of the big gaps that we're still facing within the GCF system. The first one is simplified access, and we're thrilled that there is a simplified access procedure. But if any of you have actually looked at the application, a simplified access application, you wouldn't think that this was simplified at all. If it takes a PhD and $300,000 to write a simplified access process proposal, then something is still not quite right. So we're asking to please look at what you mean by simplified access and help us with just the application process. The second point I'd like to raise has to do with direct access. So direct access for us is essential because it means that the governance of program design and the governance of program implementation resides in our country. And we're not dependent on an external entity to guide the process. It belongs to the people of Vanuatu. However, what we found is that even in direct access discussions with the GCF, we're getting very strong questions and pushbacks. It's almost like a negotiation. We spend months back and forth, trying to explain what we know we need to do and how to do it. So we would like that direct access trust to be put with the direct access entities. If we tell you clearly that this is the way to go, trust us to do that right. The third point has to do with our nationally accredited direct access entities. It is very difficult to develop a GCF project proposal and very expensive. So if we're getting accredited at the national level, we'd like Kickstart funding to go with that accreditation. So the minute you get accredited, you automatically get $500,000, $700,000 to start writing your own project proposals. So that's a barrier. We get accredited and then we twiddle our thumbs and wait, who's going to fund the project proposal development? So get that automatic funding for direct access accredited entities. And finally, this is a very important point. There is a government contribution which is required for almost all projects. The GCF comes in with some, and the government is also expected to come in with some. And that would be fine under normal circumstances, but we are not under normal circumstances. As I've mentioned, our finances are so stretched. One storm, one event, one slow onset project sets us back 10 years in our budgeting process. And we simply don't have the fiscal space to invest or co-invest in some of these projects. This needs to be, in some cases, 100% from GCF, understanding that the government of Vanuatu or other small island developing states are doing absolutely the best we can with every spare cent that we have. So make that so that the government contribution can be lessened, even sometimes to zero, and make sure that the GCF contribution is as maximal as it can be. And I have some final points, but I think we'll come to that later. But thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thanks, Chris. Chris, excellent reflections. I mean, again, you talk about trust. We very often talked about it that in the GCF when we thought about the second due diligence level. You know, the GCF is basically a fund that lets the accredited entities do the work. And that requires this question of second due diligence. Where do we start? Where do we stop with our own due diligence? And where do we start trusting those that work with us, those partners that we have as accredited entities, but also those partners that we have in the countries, as you said very rightfully, the contributions to projects, when it is a percentage and the government is already stretched and the government budget is stretched, it's very difficult. It's very, very difficult, despite the fact that it's all urgent. I'll come over to Dirk. Thanks again, Dirk, for waiting such a long time. Dirk is going to reflect a little bit on the experience from the perspective of SPC, but perhaps also some reflections on the way forwards. What are you thinking about? What is your organization thinking about? What challenges have you been seeing there? I'll come over.
Thanks very much. Kasalele, Bulavinaka, Maloelele. Nice to see some colleagues from the Pacific here. I'm originally from South Africa as well, so it's good to see people from my side of the world here. Yeah, so SPC is a direct access entity to GCF, and so maybe that's just to make sure you know that's what's influencing you know my thoughts or my responses to this. I mean, to answer the question that we've got on the slides here, how can climate finance work better? Just implement the evaluation reports that Andreas and his team are doing. If you haven't read them, they're really good. I think I said at the other session, if I'm the only person in the world reading them, at least you can know that someone is reading them. They're really good, and this is not just to you know, give a shout out to the IEU, but they cover a whole range. You know, whether it's the simplified approval process, which we've talked about a bit, adaptation, GCF's adaptation investments, broadly, the work in SIDS, the RFPs on the SAP and the EDA and all of this. They cover the whole spectrum. I've got I think I still have the stats on my phone here that I mentioned the other day, but just to highlight the fact that these reports have been, so the report on the RFPs is 17 months old, the report on adaptation is 21 months old, the report on SIDS is 2 years old, and the reports on SAP is 2.5 years old. In terms of the changes that we've seen coming from these reports set up, these reports that are specifically guiding GCF on how to change or what to address, I could be wrong, but the main change I've seen is that the SAP window was increased from $10 million to $25 million. And to our mind, that's the least useful change for the SAP modality that could have been made. They didn't change the rating from category C to category B. They didn't change the review process. It takes around 19 days shorter to do a simplified approval project than a full project. 19 days over a period of 3 to 5 years, depending, in which case the countries tell us, well, in that case, we'd rather go for a $50 million project that's category B than a $10 million project that's category C if it's taking 19 days, you know, less than a month shorter over a 3-year period. So to answer the question, you know, look at these reports, take the recommendations that have been made from people and just make the policy changes that need to happen. So that's a big cry from the countries particularly that come to us, and you know they don't have national entities, which has been mentioned, so they rely on regional entities who they feel understand the region a bit better. So like SPC, SPREP, another regional organization in the Pacific, they're coming to us asking about this, and we just have to say, well, this is the process, this is how it works, and that's what we have to deal with. I was just wondering if anyone from the GCF Secretariat or ITAP is here out of interest. We were going through, the different countries and entities, etc. Who's in the audience. Okay, so I think that's a bit unfortunate, because we want to have the people listening to the comments that are being made here. It's not directed at other countries or other entities. It's really actually directed at the Secretariat and ITAP in terms of the barriers. Maybe just reflecting on a couple of the other challenges. I think they've been pretty well articulated. You used the word bums in seats. We consistently told that countries and entities don't have capacity, and then the solution is training. Where I can, I've got colleagues from governments here. They know what they're doing. There's just not enough of them doing the work. It's the same in the entities. Where I like to think we're smart enough to do the work required by GCF or Adaptation Fund. We know what we're doing, but it's just too much work, too many requests, too many countries asking for projects. And so that becomes a big barrier, is just having the number of people. I said it in a previous intervention, but you can't train one person to do the work of 10 people, or you can't train someone how to have 27 hours in a day and 9 days a week to do the work. So training isn't the solution to capacity development, certainly from a SIDS perspective, and I think also from the perspective of African countries as well. Training is not the solution. It's capacity supplementation, and also then reducing the complexity of the processes so it doesn't take that long and that many number of people to do the work. If you've got a simpler process in general, not just the simplified approval process, but if all processes are simpler, you don't have to have the amounts of money that you were mentioning of hundreds of thousands of dollars for consultants who are brought in to do the work, but the work can be done by the countries, by the entities who are wanting to do the work. I think maybe just a last point on also what you mentioned around things of benchmarks, knowing what donors. Okay, no, two last points. Sorry, because I used the word donors and that reminded me. Trust is an issue. That's also been mentioned here. We talk about in SPC, we talk about development partners and we talk about donors. Our development partners are the ones, they also provide funding, so it's not just about, but it's the ones that we feel we can work with, that we have a relationship with, we know each other. Two of our prime development partners in the Pacific are DFAT from Australia and MFAT from New Zealand. SPC has been around 75 years, so we work with these governments who support us because they know our work and they trust us in the region. Similarly, we work with our countries and their governments, they know us and they trust us. We talk about GCF as a donor because we don't feel that we have that level of trust and engagement with them. We went through the accreditation process. It took an incredible amount of time and a lot of resources and the kinds of things that countries are struggling with their own national accreditation. And now we still have to prove to GCF with every single project that we're compliant with financial policies, that we've got anti-money laundering policies, that we've got a well thought out gender action plan or social and environmental responsibility policy. Why do we have to prove this every single time for every single project when we went through our accreditation process and you reviewed all of this? And so it's that level of trust, GCF, Adaptation Fund, Jeff, these donors have accredited entities because we need to do that work. GCF doesn't do the work directly. The accredited entities need to do the work in terms of getting the funding to go to the countries where national implement entities can execute it. So there needs to be that level of trust so that it's not this sort of top-down relationship where orders are being given or compliance is being enforced, but a mutually respectful relationship where entities are working and there's a trust that an entity will do the job that they're accredited to do. And then the last point, maybe just coming to the point on benchmarks, and we heard about pushback from GCF. I think for the Pacific particularly, we have very ambitious mitigation targets. The NDCs, Vanuatu, fully renewable by 2030, where you look at other countries that have NDCs that say, you know, a 5% reduction below 2005 levels, something. We've got these very ambitious NDCs, but we're not seeing a level of interest for both mitigation and adaptation projects. And often it comes down to things like economic indicators, dollars per ton of greenhouse gas emission reductions, and SIDS are just seen as being too small. And I think that removes a lot of the country ownership out of that. This is a priority for the country. This is what they want. But it just comes down to some kind of economic indicator about, well, sorry, that's too expensive per beneficiary, so we're going to spend the money elsewhere. And we think having more transparency about what that is, we ask about these benchmarks and we don't get responses. Having transparency so that countries know what they're up against, they know what they're trying to access, and they can make the decision on whether this is worthwhile for them pursuing. I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dirk. Excellent again, excellent points. Transparency are here. There are also this question of high transaction costs, the question of economic benefits that's often asked in GCF projects. Is that the way forward? Probably not. If you're thinking about an equal access for all different countries that we've got in the vulnerable countries, the small island developing states, the least developed countries, Africa, but also the rest that doesn't categorize in those vulnerable countries. So excellent points actually with regards to that. And then trust and the relationship. What we found here is, and we're just as a unit, we're just finalizing the performance review, the second performance review of the GCF. And what we found is exactly that. This question of who do we partner with as GCF and why and what do we want to do with them? That sort of clarity is still a little bit murky at the GCF, and that's something that the GCF hopefully is addressing in this next strategic plan that's coming out now. So consultations have happened also alongside this week and last week for that, to better understand of how this is. And we've mentioned that multiple times in the board, but as well to the secretary, that this partnership question is an important one, not only with the countries, but also essentially with those that are implementing the projects, may it be readiness or the full projects for the GCF. Okay, colleagues, this was incredibly rich. I wanted to give it again back to the audience. We've heard a little bit. I know there were many more people coming in. We've heard a little bit. We have a couple of representatives from Burkina Faso, for instance, somebody that's representing the parties. We've got a couple of academics that sat here, PhD students. We've got a couple of NGOs and so forth. Any questions to any reflections that you've seen here today? Anything that you want to share with us? That would be now. I'll just look into the room. There's nobody. Anyone wants to break the ice there? There's somebody. Here we go. Thank you very much again.
Hi, just to repeat, I'm a PhD candidate. I study climate finance at Northwestern University in the States. I had a question maybe for the gentleman from Vanuatu and from Dirk, but also like all three of you. If you have input, I would love to hear it. Dirk, you mentioned in your comments that no one from ITAP is here, and that maybe like is difficult then for implementing some of the things that have been raised today. But I was interested too in how maybe if those are the folks that you're interested in talking to, or maybe how some of the challenges that you've mentioned link up with, like the COP negotiations, perhaps the NCQG. Like I know I've participated in some of the technical expert dialogues, and Dirk has been there. But what does this advocacy or issue raising, on states or accredited entities look like beyond this space? Like what, I know probably you're doing a lot with very few people, as the point was raised, but just really interested in what that looks like, when we all go home.
It's a very forward-looking question there. Yeah, what do we do and how does it look like before we all go home? Any other question? I see Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the very insightful presentations, everyone. I think Dirk makes a really good point on the overly onerous processes of already accredited entities. I'm Catherine. I work in government of Fiji, and we work with the Climate Finance Access Hub, and we're constantly working on different proposals. Yeah, I think that's. I've got a question for you, actually. In terms of what you said about mitigation targets. So obviously you've got high mitigation or NDC targets in Vanuatu, and Fiji does as well, but it seems clear that GCF are not so interested in funding mitigation projects in SIDS because of the onus on adaptation. So I wondered if there was a thought to perhaps change that, because they say mitigation isn't such a prerogative there, and so will there be is there kind of indication that if it is in alignment with national targets, then there would be, more impetus on potentially funding mitigation projects, or more interest in funding mitigation projects. In Fiji, we have projects on EVs and mini grids, and we'd like to understand a little bit better about that. And then also to second the question on transmission into the negotiations as well. Obviously, we've been in the negotiations and looking at the GCF and Jeff angle, and I think we're only getting as far as what's in the text. I think it's on we've got as far as streamlining project approval and reporting back to fast track approach to expedite project approvals, which is quite weak text still. We're looking to further harmonization, and we need harmonization across the different funds as well, and it feels like things are moving quite incrementally, and only that something quite sort of weak on just fast tracking, which as far as I'm concerned has been in the same case for the last sort of 5 or 6 years or more. And as you said, the increases to the SAP, which isn't really that much faster or more simplified. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you very much. That's well heard. Any last question? Maybe we take 3. Anyone else? Here, are you looking around? There is a question. Here we go. Come over to you.
Thank you. So the ambassador from Fiji made an interesting comment. He says, we can't expect all the financing to come from GCF, right? And I think that's probably true. I would like to hear from all of you, your experiences and how you've been able to crowd in private finance in the climate finance discussion. I think that would be also relevant for our country, because we can't rely completely on GCF. Given what has been shared around some of the challenges of accessing finance, you can't wait for that approval to get moving. So just share your experiences in actually getting other sources of finance, particularly private finance, into this discussion.
Good afternoon, good morning. My name is Jason Spenceley. I had the pleasure to work at the GCF Secretariat, but I don't anymore, so I couldn't respond to that question. But I do work at the JEF, and here we are in a joint pavilion. The conversation is fascinating and really important and really relevant. Recently between the secretariats, which are really, we're doing our best to work closely together, we did a study which was really illuminating of finance that flows to SIDS from multilaterals, climate finance, that flows to non-LDC, non-least developed country SIDS. And it really showed how little flows. I mean, you know this better than us, but how little flows relative to other countries, especially when we consider the urgency and the vulnerability of SIDS, as you know very well. And whether you're a SID or a non-LDCs, or whether you're an LDC or a non-LDC SID, you have the same storms, right? The climate impacts don't know the LDC categorization. And so an effort that we've made in the Jeff, and we're doing this together with the GCF, is that the Special Climate Change Fund now has a dedicated window for non-LDC SIDS, and we're trying to build up that fund. There's a strategy for up to 400 million behind it, but we're waiting on commitments. There was a commitment event yesterday that IOSIS was involved in, and there was positive signals and some finance dedicated. So thank you for your leadership and continuing to highlight the urgency and the need.
Thanks, Jason. Austin as well. Thank you very much. Let's go to answer these questions. So, colleagues, we've heard again. The question is, what are we all going to do before we go home? So, how are these negotiations, these challenges reflected in some of the negotiations? How are we involved in there? We had a question on mitigation. What is the targeting of the GCF look like? I'll speak to that happily. There was a question to all of us on private sector. What are we doing to get the private sector on board to truly get the scaling? Because we know public finance is not enough for the problems that we have ahead of us. And the last one was on the dedicated window for non-LDC SIDS. So there is something that has been done. There are recognition that there are very little flows to the non-LDC SIDS. So I'll start with you, Chris, if you wanted to give it a go to some of these questions.
Sure. So we've all seen the text on the guidance to the GCF, and it's limited. But I also think that the Secretariat itself holds great power in determining its operational modalities. And this is where we've been having direct dialogue with the GCF Secretariat to say you can organize yourselves better to meet the needs of our country. In terms of private sector, we've actually had a great difficulty in getting private sector investment into the places we need it most, which is adaptation and loss and damage. It's relatively easier for investments in mitigation. Where we've had success, and I just want to highlight this, is thinking very creatively with some new technologies. So we recently got investment from private sector into blockchain technology that's allowing us to monitor and evaluate in real time where finance is flowing for adaptation and loss and damage. So these areas where private sector can find some fiscal benefit and also, directly related to private sector interests, these are areas that we have to explore more, but usually very difficult for adaptation, loss and damage, private sector investment.
Thank you very much. So a couple of points, especially when it comes to the question around private sector engagement. I think from our experience, maybe I can give two examples or two initiatives that one of which I explained in the beginning, like in terms of a nationally determined process of developing project proposals and then potentially crowding investors there. So which definitely increases the credibility of the process for the private sector because most of them are nationally determined. And the second initiative is that I'm like seeing a lot of subnational trust funds being developed. For example, we are working in Maldives, we are working in Tonga, we are working in Antigua and Barbuda, where the trust funds are gradually and steadily trying to set up processes that can crowd in private sector investment. So, for example, micro equity funds in Antigua and Barbuda or Tonga, we have trust funds where private sector equity is being invited for. But, still these processes, structuring, institutional structuring, etc., are taking a lot of time. It's basically because of capacity issues, it's basically because of the sheer time it takes. And, we also need, as some of the speakers said, a lot of technical consultancy to develop the feasibility report, baseline reports, etc., which can take it forward. So these two are examples which probably we can give more details if any one of you wants. And of course, the question of acceptance of the projects which are submitted from the SIDS. So back in the early days of CDM, we had this concept called default additionality. We always talk about, for example, if you're coming up with a biogas unit or if you're coming up with a unit that is a sure shot case of mitigation, we call it as default additionality case. And that time I still remember the UNFCCC CDM Executive Board used to fight for that in terms of how with members in terms of how we can credibly determine the default additionality. So potentially, as Chris said, we have the figures, evidence, which says that some countries are default cases of high levels of vulnerability. So we were discussing with some of the countries where the sea level rise led to very clear salinization of the rice fields, paddy fields. So what else can they do? Like if they submit a project for an integrated mangrove fisheries, why should we look at all the rest of the nuances before it takes 3 years for the project to get approved? It's a classical default additionality case. So that's one area where probably we can think about making methodologies that enables country to move faster on that actually. Yeah, I think, and also from when talking for the GCF, you know, it's country contributions, the credibility in terms of deploying finances, and I know like from the GCF side, the auditing part is strong. So obviously the deployment process generates a lot of documentation which allows the funder to deploy funds credibly so that the transparency is ensured. But at the same time, when you look at the preparedness of the countries, we oftentimes see that it's just like 1 or 2 people in the unit. So obviously there are delays happening from both sides actually. So the process side is strong, obviously the capacity side is weak, it's not matching. And that's why, because I heard in one of the meetings when Jerry was talking about a 35 days approval, which was I think the record in the case of GCF, to 3 years actually. So how do we reduce the gap and probably bring it to a kind of a minimal or an acceptable figure? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. We don't have much time left, so I'll try and be very brief. Just to answer the question on what now, what next, how does this relate to the negotiations, etc. You know, I think as Catherine mentioned, some of the text is quite weak at the moment. And I know particularly for the Pacific, because we're so small, most of our NDAs are also the negotiators, you know, all the direct access entities in the case where they're government are also the negotiators. So they're very well aware of these problems. And I've got about 400 WhatsApp messages that make it very clear that they're pushing very hard about these issues, but just not seeing the traction. But for some of the issues that we've described, I mean, it's almost besides the point. I don't think it should take a direction from a certain decision, you know, made at the UNFCCC COP27 to change a process that we can see is flawed and problematic. You know, so I don't see how it should take some kind of directive when we've got the reports from the IEU anyway, coming back to that, that are saying these are the challenges. It's just logic and common sense. And so that would maybe be sort of what we're looking towards is seeing these things come into play. In terms of maybe just touching on the point about the Special Climate Change Fund under the GEF with the window for SIDS, it's unfortunate the gentleman just said that and left immediately. So that's also something that we're very interested in, you know, for SIDS and particularly the SCCF, because most of our SIDS in the Pacific aren't least developed countries anymore. They've graduated despite the challenges. You know, being devastated by cyclones or whatever, they've managed to graduate beyond that. But the need is still there; it's still apparent. And as you said, you know, a cyclone hits you, whether you're a middle-income country or whether you're an LDC in the Pacific, you still get slammed. So very excited about that. I think just 2 points: seeing commitments go into that, and it's maybe touching on a point that was made more broadly. Was it 4 projects that GCF board didn't even consider at the last board meeting because they haven't received the funding replenishment? I think it was 4 projects that are technically approved, all fine, but the board just didn't look at them because they don't have the funding. Adaptation fund critically short of funding despite being the most effective, the most efficient, the fastest fund to work with. And I think Jeff seeing the same thing, there's decent funding available in LDCF, but not the Special Climate Change Fund. So across the board, but particularly for the Special Climate Change Fund window for SIDS, call for countries to keep good on their word and make the pledges that they're making. Another request I would have made or suggestion I would have made to to the GEF is to consider reopening accreditation. They've only got, I think, the 12 entities that they have. And if anyone has followed the GEF or Adaptation Fund board meetings, we know there's some serious questions being asked of some of the agencies that have the largest portfolio with these funds, the largest global portfolio, and serious questions asked about their own transparency and compliance and all that. So if we're getting hammered with, if direct access entities are getting hammered with compliance, but you've got these big problems with the international entities, maybe it's time to reopen GEF accreditation and let some new entities, old entities, in the case of entities like SPC who've been around, but new entities accredited to the fund, who do have, the compliant policies, which would again go a long way, I think, to enhancing the direct access that we've talked about already. Thank you.
Thanks, Dirk. Thanks, Uni and Chris. Remarkable responses to these questions. We know and we hope that it doesn't take a directive to make change. Again, I think I've said this in the beginning. We have noticed this and we have discussed this. I've seen this here in many meetings as well. People are basically hinting at the aspect that the time for incremental change is over. We don't have much more time. We need really a full transformational change of some of these processes. May it be with innovative technologies that driving things, or may it be with more adaptation projects that are truly helping the resilient questions on the ground. That's a big question. So just to say, should it be more mitigation? Should it be less mitigation for the GCF? It's very hard to answer this because the mandate is clear. We are here for 50-50. So we'll be looking across the portfolio, trying to get to a 50-50 parity between adaptation and mitigation projects. We in anticipation of the new strategic plan of the GCF, we've heard that direct access is going to be a key topic. It's going to be a key priority for the strategy. We've also heard that given the adaptation discussion that we've had in the past years, adaptation will be seeing something, and the question of how to do adaptation in private sector will be something that will be in the minds of the GCF, at least of those that are looking at the strategic planning. That's what we know now. There's a couple of other considerations that look at readiness to streamline, and I think we've heard this in the discussion today, to streamline readiness in a way that it helps to bring direct access entities up to speed to really be in the projects right away and not have disjointed processes that take 3 years there and another 3 years there, or more or less that sort of thing. So these things are in the minds. We'll hope that we'll know more by the beginning of next year when we continue with the replenishment discussions, as well as with the strategic outline of the GCF for the next period. So thanks again for staying such a long time. You've been good sports. Thanks for the panelists. This has been a great discussion, and it's been really an open and frank discussion. Again, it's great to see at the pavilion of the GCF and GEF to be evenly critical of these processes and these organizations. So thanks again for tuning in, and I wish you a wonderful day. There are a couple more events from the IEU. We will not be here at the GEF and GCF pavilion. We'll be at other pavilions. We have one right now at South Africa. We've got another one this afternoon at the Namibia pavilion. If you care, come and join us there for a discussion on biodiversity and climate. What can we learn from climate for the discussion on biodiversity? And then we have another couple of events on Friday at the Korean pavilion to discuss the second performance review. So if you have time and if you're interested, come and join us. Thank you so much for staying so long. Thanks.